confirmed that the government will continue and there will be no replacement for it without a decision from the federal court. All political blocs must respect the decisions of the federal court. The nomination of Haidar al-Abadi is a clear violation of Iraq's constitution. Political blocs must refuse this illegal appointment and violation of the constitution if they are keen to see a stable Iraq.
I hope the designation of the new prime minister in Iraq will untie the knot and lead to the establishment of a new government and teach a good lesson to those who aim for sedition in Iraq.
Vice President Biden and I called Dr. Abadi to congratulate him and to urge him to form a new cabinet as quickly as possible, one that's inclusive of all Iraqis and one that represents all Iraqis. I pledged our support to him, as well as to President Massoum and Speaker Jabouri as they work together to form this government.
I urge the international community to do even more to provide the protection they need. And I condemn in the strongest possible terms the systemic persecution of individuals from minority population and those who refuse the extremist ideology of IS and associated armed groups.
Hello and welcome to the show. You're watching Between the Lines with me, Sergeant Preradovic. Well, Iraq has finally selected a new prime minister, but it's not the incumbent Nouri al-Maliki, but rather one of his closest advisors, Haidar al-Abadi. That decision by the country's president was quickly endorsed by both Washington and Tehran. But Nouri al-Maliki refuses to step aside. Now, all of this is, of course, unlikely to help the situation north of Baghdad, where the U.S. recently launched airstrikes against so-called Islamic State militants in what has been dubbed Washington's latest humanitarian intervention. So lots to discuss this evening, and for that, let's bring in our guests now. In the studio, I'm joined by Mr. Sami Al-Halabi. He's a political analyst. From London, we have Sajjad Jiyad. He's an independent researcher on Iraq. And from Boston, Mr. Daniel Patrick Welsh. He is an anti-war activist. A warm welcome to all of you, gentlemen. I'd like to begin in the studio now with Mr. Halabi. Haidar al-Abadi, is he the right man to steer Iraq out of this current crisis, in your view?
I don't know if he's the right guy, but I think he's the only person right now who has enough credibility to possibly do so.
Why do you say that?
Because
what makes him different from his predecessor? Let's put it like that.
Well, I mean, he's a new face, number one. I mean, and
Is he
faces.
really?
Yeah, well, he is a new face. I mean, he's very similar in his profile to Maliki, although he has been a well-known politician for a long time. He's an anti-Ba'athist since the 70s. He's well-known in the West. He's very open-minded, comparatively speaking, to Maliki, let's put it that way. The other side of this coin is that Maliki has lost all his credibility. I mean, he has no support from Iran. He has no support from the U.S. He has no support locally. His militias are no longer supporting him. Sistani just came out and said he wants him to step down. So Maliki's done. Who's the next person who can come in? Obviously, it has to be a Shia. Obviously, there has to be some sort of accordance with the Iraqi constitution, which is that they should select from the largest bloc, which, Haidar al-Abadi is a part of. So in that sense, Maliki's arguments can be either bogged down in details or discounted completely. I think they'll be discounted completely because at this point we don't have time for details. There's an emergency at hand in Iraq. And so given all of these elements, I think right now he's the only one with enough credibility to possibly create a coalition in the medium term, in the short term garner enough support to do what's needed in order to rout ISIS, and then in the long term, hopefully create a government that can govern by consensus. Otherwise, we're looking at the splintering of Iraq and a much more disastrous situation, which will cost many more lives and much more of a problem in Iraq.
Which looks like it might happen anyways. I mean, nothing is there to suggest that Mr. Abadi would be able to prevent that from happening. But I want to pick up on a point that you just made there with Mr. Jihad in London, if I can. That news that's coming into us over the past hour or so that the leading Shia cleric in Iraq, Saeed Sistani, has called for Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to step down. How significant is that in itself?
Thank you for having me. Well, with regards to the news that Ayatollah Sistani has called upon the outgoing Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to step down, he actually wrote a hand-signed letter to the Dawah party, so Maliki's own party, over a month ago now. And that was the reason that the Dawah party was not able to go along with his nomination. And they met in their Shura council, their inner committee, Politburo, and said to him that we will not back your candidacy for PM again for a third term. So we can say that Ayatollah Sistani is definitely being probably the most significant voice above everyone else, above the foreign powers, above the political elite, who has forced this change and not allowed Maliki to go for a third term.
And Mr. Jihad, the incumbent Nouri al-Maliki said that Abadi's appointment is a breach of the Constitution. Does he have a point?
I think if it went to the Supreme Court to decide, I don't think they'll be able to back the outgoing Prime Minister's claims fully. Yes, there has been a couple of lapses in the way the Constitution has been followed. For example, not announcing the nomination of the new PM within the constitutional time limit and other incidences. So he has some point to say that the letter of the law in the Constitution hasn't been followed. But if we come to the crux of the argument, which he says that he is the leader of the largest bloc and so he by default should have been nominated according to the Constitution, the issue of who the largest bloc is has not been decided unequivocally in favor of Maliki yet.
He also did say that earlier today, he said that it would take the ruling of a federal court in order for him to leave office. Many would say that a federal court may rule in Maliki's favor because he is known to have very close links with the judiciary, to put it mildly.
I doubt that the judiciary would issue anything specific that clearly says Maliki must remain the PM. I think what he's relying on is some sort of interpretation of any ruling that comes out to show that he's the legitimate candidate for Prime Minister. So maybe something along the lines again saying that his State of Law coalition is the largest bloc and they recognize that he is the leader of the largest bloc. But that still would not be enough because there are other interpretations of how the largest bloc is formed. And we know that the State of Law Alliance, State of Law Coalition was also part of the National Alliance. And Maliki stood there on the 28th of June next to Ibrahim al-Jafari, who's head of the National Alliance, when the statement was read out that the National Alliance was the largest bloc. So I think it would be difficult for Maliki to get and extract a ruling from the Supreme Court that would absolutely make clear that Maliki should be the Prime Minister. But yes, he's willing to push to great lengths to prove that he is the legitimate candidate.
Mr. Welsh, let's bring you into the discussion. What do you think of all this? Do you think that this is it for Nouri al-Maliki in Iraqi politics?
Well, I think the fact that Tehran jumped on board so quickly does kind of sound the death knell, but I think the legalistic arguments are really beside the point. Like Sami al-Halabi said at the beginning, it's a matter of expedience, and the question that I would ask is the complete, confluence of will, where you have the kind of slow motion coup that the U.S. is always pushing when it wants a regime change. For the past month or so, whisper campaigns about Maliki must go, and now, lo and behold, this is exactly what has been brought to pass. And I think the other thing that needs to be brought in, whether or not it's Maliki or al-Abadi or anyone else, what the U.S. goals are in Iraq. And I know that we're running a show called Between the Lines, and you really have to read between the lines to see when Obama comes out and says that he wants al-Abadi to form a unified government and unify the country. This is, of course, completely cynical. The United States wants nothing of the sort. They've always wanted a weak, divided state, and one that leans toward Washington. And they'll keep pushing until they get it, apparently.
Mr. Halabi, one phrase that stuck out there, slow motion coup, is that what we're seeing unfold in Iraq?
I think that's an accurate description of what's been happening over the past couple of weeks, and especially since the election in Iraq. But I think what I want to pick up on really is that the fact that Iran got on board so quickly means there was some sort of coordination between Tehran and Washington on this point, and I think that that's very relevant in this case because everybody sees the big problem and the big elephant in the room, which is ISIS. And no, it's in nobody's interest at this point, not the Americans, not the Saudis, not the Iranians, to have ISIS continue to gain ground in Iraq. Now, is it in anybody's interest to see them gain ground in Syria or continue to be a pressure point for Bashar al-Assad? That's a different story. But in Iraq, where the interests of the United States are very clear in terms of their economic interests, their interests in Erbil, their interests in not seeing Baghdad fall, these are things that the Americans will not accept. These are things that the Iranians will not accept. And therefore, because the interests are aligned, I don't see that this was really an uncoordinated it just so happens that Iran got on very quickly.
Okay, but there is many people who are saying that the problem was American intervention in the first place, that the creation of this ISIS or IS or whatever you want to call them stems from American intervention. And I see you want to jump in there, Mr. Welsh. Go ahead.
Well, I think I agree up to a point. But if you notice, Obama, first of all, he uses ISIL and not ISIS. So he conveniently drops off the last S because he doesn't want to admit that it's the CIA's baby to put pressure on Assad in Syria. So you just leave off Syria and add Levant, But what he also has done is made it very clear the threat was against Erbil and in the north, in Kurdistan. And so the kind of potentially separate Kurdish oil state, which, if it were separate, would be the 9th largest oil producer in the world, is clearly what is the U.S. interest. They can hopefully for them, is to shape ISIS's devastation. And the humanitarian thing is completely beside the point. The U.S. does not give a damn about any humanitarian crisis. But they can use it as this kind of R2P cloak in which to guise their current intervention. And as long as ISIS stays away from Kurdistan and doesn't conquer Baghdad outright, the U.S. has been very slow to get involved, and I think there's some coordination over the political choice of who's going to succeed. But I really don't think the Iranians can be that much on board with the U.S. agenda in terms of shaping ISIS's advance. Not really even blunting it too much. A couple of pinprick strikes on U.S.-made weapons is not a ground war, and it's not going to stop ISIS. And I don't think the U.S. really wants to. I think they want to keep it away from their interests. But a chaotic South and a divided country are the goal.
If I can just jump in for a second, I don't think that. You call ISIS the CIA's baby, and I would agree to a certain extent. But ISIS, the formation of this so-called organization, so-called state, to put it better, what is a very murky affair. It's bogged down in the Saudis' role. It's bogged down in the CIA's coordination with Saudi intelligence in Syria. In Syria, the groups then merged to become ISIS, the foreign fighters that were inspired by Al-Qaeda ideology, so on and so forth. All of this contributes to the formation of what we see today. Now, do I think that they pose an existential threat to the Kurdish regions? Yes, I do. Without the American support, the Peshmerga won't be able to hold off that long. The bottom line is that maybe a lot of people don't want to see more American intervention. But right now, if nothing happens, nobody has the firepower really in order to stop the advance of ISIS except for the Americans. And I think that Iran, at least Iran understands that, because Iran is being pragmatic. And I think that there really is some sort of coordination, if not coordination, at least acquiescence on the part of the Iranians, that the Americans will take into account their interests, which happen to be aligned right now with the Iranian interests. And I think that Iran is pragmatic in that way, and they will, if not coordinate, Daniel, but they will at least turn a blind eye at the moment.
Mr. Welsh, it is difficult to believe that argument, isn't it? If you're talking about the fact that these groups like ISIS were created, where the CIA's baby were an intelligence project for the Middle East, then how could we assume that they're about to bomb the people who they used to, forward their own geopolitical interests in the Middle East?
Well, it does appear cynical and almost unbelievable, but in effect, that is the modus operandi of the secret services and of the deep state and the foreign policy apparatus of U.S. empire. That's always what they do, is they want to be able to pull the genie out of the bottle and put it back in whenever they want. They did it with Al-Qaeda. They want to do it with the fascists that they put in power in Kiev. They have more control than they say, but as Sami pointed out, it is an existential threat to Kurdistan, and that is what scares the Americans. I would go along with the idea of acquiescence rather than coordination, because I was talking to a friend about this just before we came on air, and what he said is that Tehran is playing chess while everyone else came to play checkers. And so, okay, whatever. Maliki, al-Abadi, we can wait this out. There is no natural connection between the Iraqi people and the Iraqi state, unless it's a puppet government, with the Americans. It's like Eduardo Galeano said so many years ago, it would be strange if the cure were to come from the United States, the same place which brought us the disease. And so Tehran has to wait. There will obviously be closer ties between Iraq and Iran than there have ever been, certainly since been viewed with Saddam in power. And so they just are playing a very smart and a very good waiting game, I believe.
Okay, I want to bring back Mr. Ziad back into the discussion, if I may. Mr. Ziad, you heard a lot of what was said there. What are your thoughts on some of this? And do you think that American intervention in Iraq could make the situation better or worse?
Oh my God. Sorry.
So firstly, we have to understand that this is real politics. This is a game to assert spheres of influence, and nearly every international power is involved in this game. So the local countries, the local neighbors to Iraq, the United States, the European Union, everyone has interest in moving Iraq to a particular direction. So that's very clear to see. Now, with regards to Iraq, the situation is not in isolation, because there is a larger situation in Syria. Now, ISIS could have been obliterated by Mr. Assad in Syria, but obviously he prefers some sort of presence for them while they are committed to fighting the FSA and the other rebels. So there's a reason for ISIS remaining powerful in Syria. And also, Turkey itself has allowed ISIS in Syria to operate freely, and they would not have done so without America's input on this, and blessing at least. Now, why did ISIS get so powerful in Iraq after 2 years in the Syrian desert? Because essentially nobody wanted to act. In the Congress Foreign Affairs Committee, Brett McGurk, who is the Deputy Secretary of State with regards to Iraq and Iran, says in testimony that since March 2013 they have had solid intelligence showing that ISIS is meaning to and will eventually take over a large chunk of Iraq. Now, for the United States, initially that's not a bad thing. Why? Because it cuts off the overland route from Iran to Syria. So it stops Iran from moving its militias, its supplies, from gaining complete access to Syria through Iraq. And also it means that the Iraqi government has pressure on it, and the United States is able to impose certain conditions in return for assistance. When the situation got slightly out of hand and suddenly the Kurdistan region was threatened, the Iranians had said to the Kurds that if the United States will not assist, we will assist. Just like we assisted Baghdad and stopped ISIS getting to Baghdad, we can do the same for you guys and stop ISIS getting to Erbil. If you accept, we'll be able to intervene on this point. The United States did not want to lose its leverage and influence, especially with the Kurds that it already has in Iraq, and so stepped in to protect the Kurds because it did not want Iran to step in and protect the Kurds.
Why is it so important, Mr. Halabi, for the Americans to prevent the fall of Erbil to ISIS militants? We have seen the fall of Iraq's second city of Mosul. We have seen the fall of the country's biggest dam, the fall of the city with the country's biggest Christian population, and nothing was done. And now all of a sudden, as soon as these groups turn towards Erbil, we've seen airstrikes being launched.
Well, the simple answer is money. Erbil houses ExxonMobil, Erbil houses Chevron. There are thousands and thousands of American citizens in Erbil. There's the U.S. consulate in Erbil. I mean, all of these things contribute to that logic. Secondly, if Iraq does splinter, which is a large possibility at this point, Kurdistan, or the Kurdistan regional, what is currently the Kurdistan regional government, is the only viable, sort of loose, viable state that could be instituted. And what that would mean would be there would be a state that could possibly supply oil and gas to Europe that is not Russian. I mean, it's an alternative. And therefore, the Americans have that interest very, very clearly in the back of their heads and in their calculus when they go and say, this is our red line. The same for Baghdad. I mean, Baghdad is also a red line. But, Baghdad is a red line for the Iranians as well. That's why we're seeing that these two areas are very, very much off limits to ISIS. Now, what I'm more worried about Aleppo falling under the sphere of ISIS than I am worried about Baghdad or Erbil, because under no circumstances will the Americans let this. I mean, you saw the complete turnaround on Chuck Hagel came out and said, we're not going in. It's a couple hours ago. I was watching the news. I see that they're saying all options are on the table, even ground troops with a humanitarian purpose. I mean, troops don't have a humanitarian purpose. Let's not kid ourselves here. So I mean, that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, Mr. Welsh, what do you think about that? First of all, do you think that the Americans are in one way or another working towards partitioning Iraq and maybe Syria as well?
They have been talking about this for many years, and there's no question that it was the initial end game. I mean, it's in you either have regime change where you come in and you destroy the whole country and set up a puppet government. If you can't do that, you have the empire of chaos, which is what they accomplished in Libya, and maybe you have a little bit of both in Syria. You have a combination as well in Ukraine. And so it really is a geopolitical game. And what I think is, maybe I'm too hopeful and maybe too Pollyanna-ish about it, but I think all of these hotspots flaring up at the same time are kind of indicative of the death throes of empire. You have the beginning of the BRICS Bank. You have the 500 million barrel a day oil deal between Russia and Iran to end run not only the Iranian sanctions but now the anti-Russian sanctions. You have all of this pressure that just isn't working. It isn't working the way it used to, and Washington can't completely call the shots the way it does. The humanitarian thing is a complete joke. It's not just that there was, obviously troops on humanitarian, but the idea at all of this R2P is a complete sham and a complete fraud. Otherwise, why would they be restocking the ethnic cleansers in Gaza or restocking the ethnic cleansers in East Ukraine? They don't give a damn about humanitarian concerns. They're concerned about losing their grip, and I knock on wood, I think that's kind of starting to happen.
Okay, gentlemen, we are going to continue the discussion in just a moment, but right now we're going to jump to a quick break. Do stay with us.
The crisis of capitalism, the European impasse, the energy shortages, the emerging power of Asia, the economic power of the Arab world, the economic debate, informative, revealing, and progressive. It discusses the economic event of the world.
Economic debate, where the numbers reveal the truth.
Depth, clarity, substance. Beyond the discourse,
beyond politics, beyond the shallowness of everyday politics.
Welcome back. You're watching Between the Lines. Just to remind you, we're talking about the ongoing political crisis in Iraq. And I want to jump over to London to Mr. Jihad. I want to pick up on a point that you made just before we went to the break there about this rivalry between the Iranians and the Americans when it comes to Iraq. Now, back in June, Mr. Abadi said to the Huffington Post, he said, if U.S. airstrikes happen, we don't need Iranian strikes. If they don't, then we may need Iranian strikes. Is this one of the reasons that the Americans decided to launch airstrikes in Iraq?
Of course. Iran was one of the only nations to stand by Iraq and say that we will give assistance. So they were the ones who repatriated some of Iraq's planes from the Gulf War back to Iraq. They supplied some ammunition. They sent some military advisors while there was a massacre occurring in the northern part of Iraq. Remember, Mosul fell on the 10th of June, and Mr. Obama decided to act on the 8th of August. That's 2 months. 2 months of massacre, 2 months of displacement, 2 months of ethnic cleansing, 2 months of genocide. And his statement refers to the plight of the Yazidis, who have suffered greatly. But for 2 months, the Shia Turkoman, the Shia Shebek, the Assyrian Christians of Mosul and other parts of northern Iraq have been suffering, and yet there was no contribution to assisting them in any sort at all. The Iraqi government had been requesting military support for years, actually, in terms of direct supply of weaponry, and also in the fight against ISIS, who have been quite active for over 2 years now, and yet none was forthcoming. So, of course, when we see that one of the only nations to help Iraq was Iran, and then later Russia, the Americans began to see that they would lose complete influence in Iraq. The skies would be dominated by Iraqi and Russian and Iranian warplanes, and they would have much less of a foothold in Iraq than they do now. We say to Mr. Obama, if you had addressed the issue of the humanitarian suffering earlier on and did some action that the people could see, it would have been much better than for you now to have come out and said, we will only step into Iraq because the Yazidis are being threatened, or the Kurds. We say to him, isn't the life of a Shia Iraqi or a Turkmen Iraqi or a Christian Iraqi the same value as that of the Yazidi or the Kurd? It is unfair for you to divide the people in this way. And I think this is a bitter resentment on the ground, and for some Iraqis, especially the people of the South, they remember 1991, the uprising that President Bush himself supported and called for the Iraqi people to rise up against Saddam, and then stood by on the sidelines and allowed them to be massacred. And that hasn't been forgotten till now. That is why the people of the South did not come out and greet the Americans with flowers and hugs, because they remembered what had happened in 1991 when they stood by and allowed Saddam to massacre the people of the South. And so it is definitely an issue now for America of wanting to maintain some sort of leverage and control in Iraq by stepping in and not allowing Iran and others to take control.
Mr. Welsh, how far are the Americans willing to go in Iraq to achieve their objectives, which, of course, at this point are not very clear?
Well, I mean, that is the $5 question, if you will. The imperial overstretch is so massive and is so crushing to the economy at home and to the political view of the United States from abroad, that they're in one respect, their hands are tied in that sense, and also they don't have a clear view. The State Department is completely tone deaf. If you watch these farcical, like almost circus-like press conferences with, particularly with respect to Eastern Europe, with Jen Psaki and Marie Harp, in China, you get the impression that there's no one running the ship. They don't know what's going on except for these age-old drives, which are imperial drives and ones that were laid out by the neocons in the plan for New American Century, and all this stuff of dividing and holding Iraq. I don't think there's absolutely no will within the United States internally politically for boots on the ground again. I think that is a complete non-starter. And with these kind of surgical strikes, I'm not sure how far you can get with this. I think basically it is a PR game, like both guests said, to kind of get in ahead of the Iranians, and also to maintain some credibility in terms of the projection of power around the world. I really think that it's like firing a bunch of diplomatic scuds at a whole range of problems.
Yeah, and if it doesn't work, it's likely to backfire as well. And I mean, it's difficult to believe, Mr. Halabi, that a couple of surgical airstrikes, quote unquote, will deter this ISIL militant group from moving into Erbil or expanding their presence in northwestern Iraq.
I think the U.S. response will be proportional to how much it needs to protect.
Which means, so you're saying they might put boots on the ground? I'm
saying if things develop and they can't keep a lid on the situation, they will go as far as they need to. And then, when that when things start to change, and if there is maybe the suggestion that boots could come, there would be large strikes on various areas of Iraq, the Iranians could change their calculus as well. What I think is more important to note at this point is not what's going on in the short term. We understand the geopolitical forces at play in the short term. What's going to happen later, I think, is more important at this point. What's going to happen when, Haider al-Abadi is the prime minister? What's going to happen when he tries to form a coalition government in Iraq? Who's going to get the key ministerial posts? Will they be aligned with the United States? Will they be aligned with the Iranians? Will there be a deal on the nuclear issue between the Americans and the Iranians that incorporates Iraq and its government and how it will be run? Or will we get into a situation where Iraq is allowed to splinter by whoever has the interest in them doing so? If the Americans can consolidate Kurdistan, if the Iranians can consolidate the rest of Iraq, I don't think that's possible, the latter. I think the former could be possible. And then we get to another situation. And this, I think, is more important to watch in the long term. We need to look at the U.S.-Iranian relationship that is a relationship of necessity. Because, as Daniel was saying, what's happening in the region is not the age-old, the Americans throw their weight around and everybody kind of cowers in fear. People are aware that things have changed. And the Americans, I think, first and foremost, I would, somewhat disagree with Daniel's assessment that they don't know what they're doing. They're very aware of their situation on the ground. They're very aware the situation has deteriorated on the ground, and they have to take more pragmatic steps. One of those steps is a sort of acquiescence, a sort of negotiation, and a possible future coordination on the future of Iraq with Iran. Syria is another issue. We can have another show about it, and we can talk about it for hours. But if we're talking about Iraq, I think that this is what we have to watch. And things are changing. And the relationship between Iran and the U.S. is changing. The rhetoric, the narratives, everything they say in public is changing. That's emblematic of something changing behind closed doors. And I think that that's the more important thing to focus on if we're going to see any sort of development in Iraq come to change in one way or another.
Mr. Jihadi, what are your thoughts on that? If we look at the appointment of Haider al-Abadi, whether Maliki decides to accept defeat and leave office or not, is it likely that al-Abadi will be able to bridge the gap between the Sunnis, the Kurds, and the Shias, or are we likely to see Iraq disintegrate into 3 different states?
I think it will be neither. I don't think Haider al-Abadi will be able to suddenly wave his magic wand and get Iraq all sorted, but I don't think Iraq will disintegrate either. I think it will just limp along for another 4 years as it has now. Partly that is because of the way post-2003 Iraq was structured. So part of it was the doing of Mr. Bremer in Iraq. His actions when he was head of the CPA has led to this violent insurgency that we have in Iraq since 2003, since August, and it hasn't stopped ever since. The car bombs, the mass killings, the targeting of innocents has not stopped since summer 2003, since a couple of months after the US invasion. So partly it is because of those initial actions, partly it is because it has become a default necessity to have a unity government, to have political opponents all taking part in one government and forcing them to try to work together, which, as we know, is it's almost impossible to do. If you put all political rivals, despite what happens in the elections, you put them all into one government, how likely is it that you'll be able to succeed? Very unlikely. I'm not aware of one country in the world, one running democracy that takes in all the parties despite what happens in the elections and forces them to become part of a government, and they still manage to do well. I have not seen that before. And that is one thing I don't think we'll see in Iraq. So part of it is not completely in the hands of Mr. Abadi. Part of it is that the system post-2005, the sectarian quotas, so starting from Mr. Brahim's decision in 2003 with the governing council to appoint Shia, Sunni, Kurd and so on by a particular number, that is carried on all the way through till 2014. You need to have a certain number of Shia ministers. The president needs to be a Kurd, the speaker needs to be a Sunni Arab, and so on. So needs this many ministries. It just doesn't work this way. So I think until we change the system, I can't see Iraq suddenly improving its method of governance, and I can see the problems continuing. Also, some of the US policies have carried over. They supported the arming of militias, whether, knowing what was going to happen or not, but they supported this Sons of Awakening movement, these mainly Sunni Arab militias, gave them weapons and money and said, go and fight Al-Qaeda on our behalf. And that has carried over today because it gave legitimacy to militias. And the same for the Shia groups as well. They believe they're defending themselves, and there are people that are willing to support them with money and backing so that they can fight for the Shia cause. So unfortunately, and again, fighting against these terrorists. So unless we have a way of strengthening the Iraqi government and seeing if everyone wants to be a real partner in Iraq, whether it's the Kurds, whether it's the Arabs, or the rest of the people of Iraq or not, and then saying, right, let's scrap parts of the system that we have that do not work, that were set up because of Mr. Brahim's imagining of how Iraq would run, and then put it into a new form of democracy that works. I do agree with part of Mr. Maliki's call for a majoritarian government, and not so much the stress on a unity government, because I don't see how a unity government could work.
Mr. Welsh, that point about changing parts of the system, which, let's face it, the Americans left behind, the Libanization of Iraq, if you will. How realistic of a prospect is that?
Well, I don't know how realistic it is, but I do think it's essential. I mean, this idea, the Libanization or the Bantustanization of everywhere that the U.S. has left its footprint is not by mistake, it's by design. And so the idea of leaving a divided and weakened entity that can no longer be a unitary solid state is part of what the U.S. has wanted from the get-go. The question is where on the spectrum of disintegration it falls. If you lean toward the possibility of limping along, as Jihad has said, and then this kind of loosely affiliated solid Kurdish state in the north, you get some of that trail of organized chaos that helps the U.S. maintain its goals. Incidentally, when I did want to clarify what I had said about not knowing what's going on, not knowing what they're doing, is what I mean is that they are unaware of their tone deafness and how they no longer have this power. They still think that they can order people around. They can tell China that they're interfering in the South China Sea, which is 10,000 miles closer to China than can tell Kiev what to do. They can tell Gazans what to do. They can tell al-Assad what to do, and they can still rule the roost in Iraq. And I think that is a horrifically misguided notion. And it's the chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak. If they can forge some sort of unity or majoritarian, however it is, to keep Iraqis' goals separate from leaning toward Washington, then the further you can go along that path, the better everyone in the region will be.
Let's talk about Iran, Mr. Halabi, a little bit before we come to the end of the show here. Now, Tehran plays a major role, of course, in Iraq. Why do you think that they turned, or perhaps decided not to back their traditional ally, Nouri al-Maliki, when it came to this appointment of Haidar al-Abadi?
Because they know that it's not sustainable. I mean, especially with regards to Daesh. Daesh's ISIS in Arabic. I mean, if you want any sort of Sunni counteraction to Daesh, especially in the Anbar province, it's not going to happen with Maliki in place. I mean, I think that by this point, the Sunnis in Iraq understand that there needs to be a significant amount of power in the hands of a Shia if Iraq is going to stay together. And I think that the Iranians understand that perspective. And, they're pragmatic. I mean, they've been pragmatic since the Americans entered full force in 2001 in Afghanistan, 2003 in Iraq, tried to put them in a pincer. We're living in a different world today. And I think that, they've bided their time pretty well. They've brought America to the table. It's not the other way around where the Americans have brought them to the table. The Iranians have brought America to the table, and now they're negotiating. And they're negotiating, as we've been talking about. They're negotiating through acquiescence. They're negotiating through some sort of coordination, tacit, implicit, whatever you want to, however you want to classify it. But there is some coordination on Iraq. And the Americans understand that. I think they really do understand, and this is the only point I think I really disagree with Daniel on, is that they do understand that their influence in this region is waning to a certain extent. They can't throw their weight around as much as they used to. And they're also recalibrating their focus. If we're talking about global geopolitical politics, they're looking more towards Asia, they're looking more towards China, and they're becoming more energy independent at home over the medium to long term. So that plays into the calculus as well. That's why we're seeing something happen between the Iranians and America on the ground in Iraq and around the region. There are other issues where they are not so coordinated, Syria being, first and foremost. But I think on this issue, they're much more coordinated, and I think everybody understands where they stand right now, and that's why this transition is happening so quickly. Is it sustainable? I don't think so. I agree completely that we have to change the structure. I'm Lebanese. I know what a sectarian system and sectarian quotas can do to your country. I know when it's not a merit-based system and it's not a majoritarian system, what so-called consensus means. It means nothing ever happens. It means nobody ever takes a decision. It means because you can't balance everything. There has to be a majority, there has to be an opposition. At some point, somebody's going to have to lose and take it and then try to win again in a fashion that's not just based on violence and car bombings and proxy wars and so on and so forth.
Mr. Ziad, going back to Iran, it's, as Mr. Halabi says, this cooperation between Washington and Tehran, does that prove that perhaps, or show that Iran's priority here is fighting ISIS militants?
Of course, for Iran, they've been caught off guard with the rapid rise of ISIS in Iraq the last couple of months. For them, losing the overground route to Syria is extremely damaging. For them, having the presence of American planes in Iraqi skies is definitely not good. At the end of the day, they have the great Satan on their doorstep, and that's definitely something not desirable for the Iranians. The issue is that Iraq is the most valuable country in the Middle East. I say this not because I'm Iraqi myself only, but because Iraq is the only country in the world that has spare capacity in its economy. Now, when I mean spare capacity, I mean it can have a huge effect on the world economy. It outputs around 3 million barrels of oil per day at the moment. It should be able to, if done properly, it should be able to output 12 million. No other country in the world is able to put that amount, and no country can even increase its capacity by that amount. Saudi Arabia is already declining, the other countries are already declining, Russia itself is already declining. The only country that can contribute significantly to world economy is Iraq, and that is why it is the most valuable country in the Middle East. It should be, if it is allowed to operate, it should be a G20 country and possibly even a G8 in terms of the size of the economy. It should be $1 trillion economy. Now that means it is extremely valuable for whoever can have the most leverage and control in Iraq. And I think what is happening in Iraq is, unfortunately, the failings of foreign policy of certain countries and also of Iraqi politicians, but partly is the system is not designed to help Iraq as it is. Unfortunately, at the moment, Iraq's democracy is not structured in a way to deliver proper governance. And also the remnants of what occurred from before 2003 are still in Iraq. They haven't been eradicated. So until we can address a couple of these issues and remove the sectarian hatred that is facing Iraq, and inside Iraq itself, I don't think we can really see a prosperous Iraq. I think ultimately that would be a bad thing for Iran and also, in most ways, bad for the US as well, because they stand to benefit from a prosperous Iraq if they're able to control it. So definitely, I think a lot of international powers are fighting for leverage in Iraq, and the reason why Iraq is suffering is because of that fighting. But what is ironic is all of them want Iraq to be prosperous so that they can benefit from it. But it's a form of, well, if I don't have it, then I won't let you have it as well.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we have run out of time on that note. I want to thank all of my guests in the studio, Mr. Sami Halabi from London, Sajjad Jiyad, and in Boston, Daniel Patrick Welch. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, and thank you for watching. Don't forget that you can catch us again at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.
I confirm that the government will continue and there will be no replacement for it without a decision from the federal court. All political blocs must respect the decisions of the federal court. The nomination of Haidar al-Ibadi is a clear violation of Iraq's constitution. Political blocs must refuse this illegal appointment and violation of the constitution if they are keen to see a stable Iraq.
I hope the designation of the new prime minister in Iraq will untie the knot and lead to the establishment of a new government and teach a good lesson to those who aim for sedition in Iraq.